For the dumbbell single leg RDL, I like to have something that I can hold on to help keep me stable during the exercise. So whether that be an incline bench or a PVC pipe, also known as staff stability, patent pending, or the bar on the cage of a squat rack or a wall or a bike, whatever it is, something to hold on to keep you stable during the exercise. There's a couple of ways you can perform the dumbbell single leg RDL, but the way that I'm going to show today, I will show two variations actually. I will go ahead and show the contralaterally loaded dumbbell single leg RDL and the ipsilaterally loaded dumbbell single leg RDL. When you set up for the contralateral, you want the dumbbell in the hand opposite to the foot that's on the ground, so opposite to the stance leg. I'm holding on to my bench for a little bit of stability. My left foot is standing on the ground. It's making contact with the floor, and my other foot is hovering over the floor. I use this swing foot as an indicator of where to translate my hip. It's kind of a guiding light for me in this movement. So some people do like to keep their foot in place whenever they hinge, but I find that by cueing people to drive that foot back and let it move backwards, people do the exercise a little bit better. So that's how I'm going to show it today, is letting that swing leg move back as I move into the exercise. I'm holding my dumbbell contralaterally, and when I move into the single leg RDL, I start fully standing with my left foot on the ground. Once I'm ready to hinge, I will slightly bend my knee and I drive my hip back. My chest comes forward as a consequence of my hip driving back, and then I bring my hip forward. In this exercise, the entire movement is led by the hip. So with that, the hip is driving back and the hip is also driving forward in the exercise. A few things that I see here. One is hip external rotation. The hip tends to flare. Really important during this exercise, and the contralateral load will actually help pull you into internal rotation. It's really important that when you go into this exercise, you're not flaring the hip out, that swing leg hip bone is actually facing the ground as you go into the exercise. AKA, this means you're maintaining a square or a neutral hip position. So that's one thing that I see. Another thing is people try to keep that stance leg totally straight the whole time. You do not want to keep the stance leg totally straight the whole time. You do want to have a slight bend in the knee as you move into the hinge, and this allows for the hip to get posterior translation, so the hip to drive backwards while still keeping whole foot pressure, okay? Because what will happen is if my stance leg is straight the whole time and I drive my hip back, I am going to be totally forced. I'm going to run out of room really quick for my hip to go back, but I'm going to be forced to rock into my heel, which is not what you want. You want to maintain whole foot pressure. That's why when you do this exercise, the hip goes back and the chest also goes forward, which is another thing I see wrong, is a lot of people want to drop that chest. I'm holding the weight, so that's where I'm going. I'm going where the weight is. I'm dropping my chest to the floor first. You want the hips to lead. So I'm holding the weight. I'm holding the dumbbell contralaterally loaded. I have a fully straight stance leg to start, and my swing leg is hovering off the ground. When I'm ready to hinge, I slightly bend my knee, I drive my hips back. I'm using this to guide my hip, and I'm maintaining a neutral pelvic position, so I'm keeping my hips square the whole time. I'm not letting my hip rotate out. I'm keeping my hips square. With that, my knees bent, my hips driving back, my hips are square, my chest is coming forward, right, as a consequence of my hip going back. So I'm maintaining whole pressure in my entire foot, the ball and the heel of my foot. I'm keeping pressure in. Once you get to a place where your hip is as far back as it can go, you bring your hip all the way back up. You do not want to go too low to the floor. That's another thing I see. A lot of people want to drop super low to the floor. That's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to create lateral hip stability. And so we want to keep weight and load in the hip. And if you go too low, you're going to start loading that lumbar spine, which is not what we want. So that lateral hip stops generating the, we stop getting the intent we want to out of the exercise, ultimately. Most people, that hip will run out of real estate a little bit below the knee. Once you get there, you're going to come back up. It's the same for the other side. Stance leg is straight. I lead with my swing leg. I'm working on really trying to keep my hips neutral. So square, I'm not flaring my hip out to the side. Slight bend in my knee, my hip goes back, my chest comes forward. As a result, I'm keeping whole foot pressure, so I'm not rocked into the heel or the toe. Once my hip is as far back as I can get it, I drive with my hip back up. An ipsilaterally loaded dumbbell single leg RDL is exactly the same maneuver. So for an ipsilaterally loaded single leg RDL, you're still focusing on the same things. You're still focusing on keeping that stance leg straight. Whenever you're ready to bend, you bend the knee, you drive your hip back. That knee bend allows for that hip to actually get into posterior translation while still keeping whole foot pressure. The chest comes forward as a result of that hip going backwards. And your hips are square, right? My hips aren't, my hip isn't going into external rotation. But the only difference is I'm holding on the same side that my stance leg is, instead of the opposite side. And what this does is this really challenges internal rotation, because in a contralaterally loaded position, my hip is naturally wanting to pull into internal rotation, so it helps people get into a good position. When you've nailed that, you can load it ipsilaterally, so now I'm challenging it. The dumbbell naturally, right, weight's pulling me this way, so I have to really emphasize keeping internal rotation, keeping a neutral or a square hip position when I go into this single leg RDL. So my hand is still holding to support the bench. My left leg is on the ground. My left hand is now holding, and my right foot is now it's the swing leg still. So I move into position. I start fully standing, slight bend in the knee. I'm hinging my hip. My chest is coming forward as a byproduct of my hips moving back so I can maintain whole foot pressure. And I'm still maintaining that neutral pelvic position. And I'm coming up. Not going too low to the floor, right? When my hip has gone back as far as it can, I'm coming back up. I'm not pushing the distance here. I'm not pushing the depth. Same with the right foot. Start fully standing. Swing legs moves back. It guides my movement. I have a slight bend in my knee. My hip goes back. My chest comes forward as a consequence. I keep square hips. And when I've run out of room, I drive with my hips back forward. My hips are driving forward. And that is the contralateral and ipsilaterally loaded dumbbell single leg RDL.